Hello everyone, my name is Georgina Rubio, and today I will present Mozambique, which is a somewhat unknown country on the African continent, characterized by an eventful history, but with a lot of potential for the future. Mozambique is a sovereign country in southeastern Africa on the Indian Ocean. Many countries share borders with Mozambique, as you can see in the map. So, for instance, in the map, you can see how it limits to the north with Zambia, Malawi, and Tanzania, to the east with the Mozambique Channel and the Indian Ocean, and to the south and west with South Africa, and to the west with Eswatini and Zimbabwe. Regarding its surface, it's the 16th largest country in Africa, with a census population of 31.2 million inhabitants. Unfortunately, it's difficult to know the exact number of citizens since 70% of those citizens live in rural areas and there's no clear control of the total census of the population. Mozambique's capital and largest city is Maputo, with a total population of 1 million people. The official language of this country is Portuguese, although many Bantu indigenous languages are also spoken within the country and also in the rural areas. And it's a little bit paradoxical because Portuguese remains the only official languages of Mozambique, while it's only spoken by half of the population. And the country's population is composed by four main different ethnic groups, which are Makawa, Tsonga, Lomwe, and Sena. And finally, tackling religion, the largest religion in Mozambique is Christianity, which was imposed by the colonial rule of Portugal. However, there are some significant minorities such as Islam and African traditional religions. In order to understand the current situation of this country, I have divided history in three parts, so it will be easier to understand the narrative of this country. So, first of all, we need to understand the pre-colonial times of the current Mozambique. So, it all started 10,000 years ago, where the first settlers were small scattered clans of nomadic people. Unfortunately, they barely left a mark and little is known about this time. Then, about 2000 years ago, Bantu speaking peoples from Niger began to move into the Congo. Thus, they reached present day Mozambique, where they dedicated themselves to agriculture, fishing, and livestock. Finally, at the beginning of the 8th century, Arab sailors reached the coast of East Africa, so their trade flourished thanks to its strategic location and the gold mines in the interior. Then ports and coastal settlements were formed in Mozambique to further Arab trade networks throughout southern Africa and India. Moving to the colonization area, which has been the one that has hit the most the history of this country. So in mid 15th century, Vasco da Gama, who was an explorer from Portugal, landed on Mozambique on his way to the Indies. And a decade later, the Portuguese had already established themselves on the island and taken control of many other Arab Swahili trading posts. So, over the next 2 centuries, they established trading posts and fortresses all along the coast, and Mozambique became the capital of the so called Portuguese East Africa. Facing with the looming partition of Africa in 1880s, Portugal was forced to claim its territories more forcefully and in 1891 signed a treaty with Great Britain that formalized Portuguese control of that area. So Portugal tried to establish a zone of effective occupation, linking its colonies of Angola on the western part of Africa and Mozambique through expeditions and obtaining recognition of other European powers. One of the most relevant events of that time was the massive migration of labor from the southern provinces of Mozambique to South Africa due to the oppressive labor legislation approved for Mozambique in 1899, which divided its population between Mozambique people with all the rights of Portuguese citizenship, and on the other hand, they had the indigenous people who were subject to colonial legislation, forced to work, and limited freedom of movement. In the late 20s, Antonio Salazar came to power in Portugal and conditions for Mozambicans worsened. Finally, the colonial period ended with the Mozambican War of Independence. It was an armed conflict that lasted for 10 years from 1964 to 1974, which was between the guerrilla forces of Frelimo and Portugal. After the period of colonization and the War of Independence, the country was devastated. The colonial power of Portugal had left Mozambique in extreme poverty, and the population was so dissatisfied. Violent confrontation between guerrilla groups began taking place along the country. So now we have the Mozambican Civil War, which was an internal conflict in Mozambique that began in 1977, 2 years after the end of the Mozambican War of Independence. On the one hand, there was the National Resistance of Mozambique, RENAMO, who violently opposed the ruling party, the Mozambican Liberation Front, based on a Marxist ideology, FRELIMO. The RENAMO was funded by South Africa, and FRELIMO initially received military aid and substantial development from the Soviet Union, and later, in addition to France, the United Kingdom and the United States. RENAMO systematically committed war crimes and crimes against humanity as part of its destabilization strategy. The aftermath of this clash was more than 900,000 deaths in combat. 5 million civilians were displaced, and many of them missing limbs of the body due to landmines. This is a legacy of the war that continues to plague Mozambique. By the early 1990s, Frelimo had abandoned his Marxist ideology. Then, with the end of the Cold War and apartheid collapsing in South Africa, support for RENAMO was withdrawn, and the first direct talks between the Frelimo and RENAMO governments were held. Finally, in 1992, a ceasefire was agreed, followed by a formal peace agreement and a disarmament and demobilization campaign under the UN supervision. After a 2-year transition with the peace agreement in 1992, in October 1994, Mozambique held its first ever multi-party elections. Preparing for elections in a country with very low literacy levels, minimal government capacity, and almost non-existent infrastructure meant that everything was being done for the first time. So collaborating with the United Nations involved several layers of authority, since new units were established to address specific aspects of peace accord. Nowadays, this country is a republic and a multi-party democracy. It has an executive president as a head of state and government called Felipe Nyusi. The Front for the Liberation for Mozambique, FRELIMO, and the Mozambican National Resistance, RENAMO, remain the country's main political forces, among many others. Since the end of the Civil War in 1992, Mozambique has held 5 general elections. FRELIMO has won them all, with RENAMO in second place. Unfortunately, peace and democracy in Mozambique are labeled as an endless transition. The management of the electoral process is characterized by corruption scandals and no transparency. And currently, there are still some clashes between FRELIMO and RENAMO. Although agriculture employs about 4/5 of the country's workforce, it only constitutes about 1/5 of Mozambique's GDP. Unfortunately, the agriculture performance is particularly vulnerable to natural disasters such as droughts and flooding. Nowadays, remittances from migrant laborers in South Africa, revenues from tourism, and the country's port and railway sector have been equally important as a source of foreign exchange. Throughout the 21st century, foreign investors have expressed interest in this country, especially since the Mozambique government has made foreign investment more attractive and it's a rich country regarding metallic natural resources. South Africa is the country's major trading partner, and India remains the country that Mozambique sends most of its exports. Other partners include the countries of the European Union and Asia. Mozambique is one of the East African countries with the richest unexploited liquid gas reserves in the region. The natural gas find would have helped generate money for its economy, as it would allow Mozambique's government to invest in energy, tourism, and infrastructure. But since its discovery, everything went wrong. Two tragedies befell Mozambique. An insurgency swept through northern Mozambique, the very region of the natural gas wealth, and a corruption scandal paralyzed the government. Therefore, international companies and private actors have been the only beneficiaries of this natural resource. Regarding the status that Mozambique occupies in different indexes of development, this country gathers low punctuation. Although it's a sovereign country that currently holds its multi-party elections, as we have seen before, and that it also has improved since independence and civil war, the past electoral campaigns were characterized by violence, much of which target opposition members to their supporters, and several politicians and activists were killed. So, this brings a feeling of insecurity and bad view on the overall governments, as it can be seen in the Ibrahim index. Moreover, hundreds of thousands of people have been internally displaced due to the ongoing Islamist insurgency in the north of the country. Mozambique also struggles with corruption and with journalists who report on it and other sensitive issues regarding violent attacks. Although it's a rich country regarding natural resources and labor force, its position in the economic opportunity status is actually very low. And now you may be wondering how it's possible that Mozambique is scored that bad in the previous reports. So to understand these results, we may focus on the challenges that nowadays are hitting the country. In 2019, there were the strongest cyclones to ever make landfall in Southeast Africa. Idai cyclones directly affected about 2 million people. The government of Mozambique has claimed that an absent international climate action has affected the most vulnerable countries. In addition to the natural disasters, Mozambique has experienced a significant increase in terrorist activity since 2019. The situation in Cabo Delgado, in the north of the country, following attacks in Palma district, is still highly volatile. Communications are limited as fighting continues. Full of thousands of people who have fled violence in other areas of Cabo Delgado end up with a humanitarian crisis. All in all, the security and environmental threats that currently exist in Mozambique are compromising the development and economy of the country, thus making Mozambique less capable of facing external challenges. Furthermore, the diseases outbreak and malnutrition make that the proper demographic development of the country does not improve properly. As we have seen in the previous slides, Mozambique's score in several development indexes is not the desired one. For this reason, the participation of Mozambique in different international agendas is so crucial for the development and prosperity of the country. The European Parliament has already warned of the worsening situation in Cabo Delgado, calling for a more coordinated regional and international effort to respond to the humanitarian crisis. Directly targeting the member states and the EU, to work closely with the Southern African Development Community in order to resolve the humanitarian crisis in the region and develop an effective action plan. Moreover, UNICEF is providing safe water, nutrition support, and child protection support in transit zones of migration. Mozambique is currently working alongside the UN to achieve some goals from the 2030 Agenda, as the formulation and implementation of Sustainable Development Goals, in line with the African Union's agenda, is a great opportunity to bring prosperity to millions of people and respond to pressing global challenges that have hit the country, such as security threats in Cabo Delgado, climate change floodings, pandemics, and humanitarian crises. The government has gone through a participatory, interactive, and transparent exercise. We engage various players in the process, including government authorities at all levels, justice administration institutions, parliaments, civil society organizations, and also the private sector. In this case, the government has shared the progress, experiences, and challenges, and also some success stories with the international community. I wanted to end up the presentation by sharing a Makua proverb, which clearly defines the spirit of walking forward despite the situation that hits the society. Thank you everyone for your attention. Here you can see the sources for the project, and you can find the citations of each source below in the description part of the video.